everyone, how are you? Are you fine? Let me to go ahead with our previous slide set. In the previous lecture, I talked about some coverage criteria. As you remember, the node coverage, edge pair coverage, and complete path coverage. And at the end of the session, we talked about the complete path coverage, that this coverage could not be possible when we have loops in our program. The complete path coverage is infeasible. So to handle loops in our programs or in our control flow graphs, we saw some proposals, some suggestions. As you can remember, execute cycles once, execute each loop exactly once, or execute loop more than once, or no execution of loop, or execute it 0 times, are some suggestions for handling loops in previous decades. But the latest notions to handle loops are around the simple passes and prime passes, as I have described them for you in the previous lecture. The Turing notion with side trips or detours are two notions to handle loops in practical view, to cover all passes, all needed passes to test control graph. So in a previous lecture, I told about the prime pass and simple pass. As you know, the simple pass is a pass from Ni to Nj, in which no any intermediate node occurs in the pass more than once, except for the first and last node. So in simple pass, we have no internal loops. A loop could be a single pass, or could be a simple pass exactly, without any other nodes or edges. A prime pass, as I defined before, is a simple pass. Is the biggest simple pass, which could not be appeared as a subpass as some other simple pass. Okay, I have done some examples for these notions, with respect to these notions, to extract the simple passes and prime passes. As I told before, to extract simple passes, we start from simple passes with length 0. As you know, each node defines a pass or a subpass with the length 0. So we have 4 in this graph. In this graph, we have 4 simple passes of length 0. Then we go ahead with passes or subpasses with length 1. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 simple passes with length 1. These 5 simple passes are these. this 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 2 to 4, 3 to 4, and 4 to 1. 4 to 1 is this edge. And then we will go ahead with passes or subpasses of length 2. There are several passes of length 2. For example, this is a simple pass of length 2. 1 to 3, 3 to 4. 1 to 2, 2 to 4 is another simple pass of length 2. 4 to 1 and 1 to 3 is another simple pass of length 2. So there are several simple passes of length 2. These passes 1 to 2 to 4, 1 3 4, 2 4 1, 2 4 1, 3 4 1, 4 1 2, 4 1 3. All of these subpasses are have length 2. Then when we extract all subpasses of length 2, we go ahead with simple passes of length 3. These simple passes 1 to 3 to 4 to 1 is a simple pass of length 3. 1 to 2 to 4 then to 1 is a simple pass of length 3. As you see, 4 to 1 to 3 to 4, 4 to 1 to 3 to 4 is another simple pass of length 3. So all of these simple passes have length 3. All of these simple passes have length 3. As you see, there is a loop in this graph, this control flow graph, and we try to extract simple passes of length 4. If there are a simple pass of length 4 in this graph, as you see, if we start from node 1, the largest pass could be this pass, 1 to 3 to 4, then to 1, and there is no pass with there is no lengthier pass in this graph. The biggest length, the biggest simple pass in this graph has length 3, because if we continue to going another node, for example 2, then we trip this pass, and then if we go ahead with another node such as 2, there is an internal loop in this path, and this causes that our path could not be a simple path. Okay, so the biggest simple path in this control flow graph has length 3. There is no other lengthier passes in this graph. But the process to detect prime passes for this graph starts with the lengthier passes. lengthier simple passes, because we define the prime pass as the biggest simple passes which could not be a subpass of another simple pass. So if you look at this list, each of these simple passes could not be a subpass of other simple passes listed in this box. So look at this pass for start from 2, not 2, to 4, to 1, and then to 2 again. This pass defines a loop in this graph which could not be a subpass of another simple pass. This is the biggest simple pass that starts from node 2 and then again reach to 2 again. Okay, and this could not be a subpass of another simple pass. This is the same for other prime passes listed in this box if you check it. We told about simple pass and prime pass coverage in previous lecture. As I told you, the prime pass coverage criteria could not subsume H pair coverage when we have a self loop in our control flow graph. Prime pass coverage criteria subsume all H pairs in any graph, in any control flow graph, except for ones that have self loop. The self loop is a loop that starts with a node and ends in itself. Okay, such as this, because when we define a simple pass such as this is not a simple pass, n to n to n, because there is an internal loop in this pass, and so that this could not be a prime pass. So prime pass coverage could not cover this subpass, and so on this subpass. Okay, so prime pass coverage could not subsume H pair coverage. This is trivial by looking at these test requirements. The test requirement for H pair coverage, according to this graph, is this set. The test requirement for each pair coverage for this graph is going from edge node 1 to node 2 to 3. 1, 2, 2 to 3. 1, 2, 2. Then go again to node 2 from self loop is another H pair. This is another H pair started for node 2. We start from node 2 and go ahead again to node 2 and then go to 3. This H pair. And this is another H pair in this graph. But the test requirement for prime pass coverage is this set. Okay, there are just 2 prime pass. The first prime pass, this is this pass 1, 2, 2, 2, 3. Another prime pass is our loop. start from node 2 and ends again in node 2. We have 2 prime paths for this graph. And if you check, this set cannot subsume this set. For example, this prime path cannot cover this path, this H pair. And this is the same for this H pair and this H pair. This prime path just subsume, just cover this H pair. And this one covers none of these H pairs because this has a length of 1 and these H pairs all have length 2. Okay, so the only prime path of this test requirement cannot cover none of these H pairs, none of the 3 H pairs. So prime path coverage could not subsume H pair coverage for graphs that have self loops. If we have no self loop, prime path coverage can subsume H pair coverage. Okay. Another example of prime path coverage is given this slide according to this control flow graph. There are some for prime paths, as I told you, we start from the biggest simple passes, and a simple path could be this one, started from node 1 to node 2 to node 3 to node 4, and then finally go to node 7. This first prime path. Another prime path could be this one, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7. This path could not be a subpath of a bigger simple path in this graph. Okay, so this is a prime path. Another prime path could be this one, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. This is a final. This is not final node in this graph. But if we go ahead again to the node 5, our path be a non-prime path because an internal loop is added to our prime path. So we stop going ahead at this node, and this could be a prime path. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. And this path is not a subpath of another simple path. Okay, this is this path. We have other prime passes in which we go ahead from other ways, such as this. We start from node 1 and go ahead from this edge. 1, 3, 4, 7 is a prime path because this path could not be a subpath of another simple path. Okay, and 1, 3, 5, 7. These two passes. And 1, 3, 5, 6. These passes. And finally, we go ahead with simple passes or prime passes of which have smaller lengths. These passes have lengths of 1, 2, 3, 4. These three passes have lengths of 3. These passes have lengths 2. This set could be defined for the loop of our control flow graph. One of them, the last one, start from node 5, go ahead to node 6, and then return back or come back to node 5. Okay, this is a simple pass which starts with node 5 and ends at this node again. Another prime pass could be started from node 6, go ahead to node 5, and then go ahead to node 7. This prime pass. Another prime pass can be started from node 6 is that start from this node, go ahead to 5, and then come back to node 6. This pass, all of these three passes define, these two passes defines loop. So these two passes could not be located as a subpass of other simple passes. So they are prime pass. Please note how prime pass coverage can handle loops. Please remember that these notions is defined as a solution of handling loops in our program to cover them by in our testing process. So please look at these these prime passes, and see how they handle loops to execute loops 0 times, 1 time, and more than 1 time. Okay. This prime pass, if we define a tour in this graph, if we define a test pass in this graph that cover this prime pass, we have defined a tour, we have defined a test pass that executes loop more than once. For example, executes loop twice. And for this prime pass, we can execute loop just once. And when our test pass cover this prime pass, we have executed loop. We have executed no loop 0 times. Okay, so we have experienced this suggestion. Let me see. Several suggestions for handling loops in previous decades are executing loops 0 times, once, and more than once. These suggestions could be handled by covering prime passes. So we go ahead in this slide to see how covering all prime passes to handle loops. We define some new notions to cover prime passes in practice. These concepts include touring, side strips, and detours. We define all of these concepts. As you know, prime passes do not have internal loops. When we have an internal loop, so the internal loop independently could be a prime pass, but internal loop could not be a subpass of another prime passes. This is obvious for you at this time, but you know that test passes may have internal loops, because as you know earlier, our test passes start from an initial node and ends at a final node. So test passes have visited some nodes other than our nodes in our prime passes. Okay, so it's possible to have a test pass in which we have some loop. Okay, for example, this could be a test pass. For example, we start from node 1 to node 3, 5, 6, 5, 7. This is a test pass. And this test pass, as you know, have a loop. But our prime passes have not a loop. Okay, we try in this lecture to connect these two notions, how test passes could cover all prime passes. And we know if we cover all prime passes, we have tested our loops with 0 times execution, execute loop once and execute it more than once. And we provide all suggestions for handling loops. So we define tour. These concepts, firstly, we start with the concept tour. A tour is a test pass P which can tour subpass Q if Q is a subpass of P. So in this example, this is a tour, this is a tour, or this is a tour, this is a tour, which this tour, in which this tour cover this prime pass. This is a subpass of this tour. Okay, these tour 1, 3, 5, 6, 5, 7 tours the subpass 5, 6, 5. Tours our loop once. Okay, because this our loop is a subpass of our test pass. So a tour is defined as a test pass that tours subpass Q if subpath Q is a if Q is a subpath of P. It's trivial, it's not difficult definition. But there are two variations for tour. The first variation is a tour with a side trip, and the second one is tour with detour. What is a tour with side trip? A test path T tours subpath Q with side trip if and only if every edge, please note that in this definition we focus on edges. In the next one we focus on nodes. If and only if every edge in Q, the Q is our subpath, is also be in P in the same order. A test path P towards subpath Q with side trip if and only if every edge in Q is also in P in the same order. What's the meaning of this definition? Let me talk with you about this definition. Please look at this control flow graph. This path starts from node 1, node 2, node 3, node 5, and finally go to node 6. Is a prime path. Is a prime path. And keep this prime path in your mind. Then look at this test path. Suppose we have a test path that starts from node 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, then go to 5, and finally go to 6. These test paths, as you know, visit all edges of our first prime path, or defined prime path. Or the prime path is this path, in which all these edges exist in our prime path. And in our test path, we have this test path. As you know, this test path covers all edges of our prime path in the same order. In the same order. Okay. So we say our test paths cover all prime paths with a side trip. This is a side trip between our edges, or these two edges. We have a side trip and come back soon. Come back to this node. Our sound trip start from this node, and come back soon to this node and go ahead with the later nodes, with the later edges. So this is a side trip. Another definition or another concept in this slide is a tour with a detour. A test path P tours subpath Q with detour if and only if every node in Q is also in P in the same order. Please look at this figure again. In tours, with detours, the order of nodes in our test path is important. Okay, so we could have any test path that visit all nodes of our prime path in the same order. Look at this test path. Our prime path again is this prime path, and our test path for this concept could be this one: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not 3, 4, 5, and then go ahead to node 6. As you know, this test path cover all nodes of our prime path in the same order. So we say that this test path towards our prime path with detour. We have a detour at this node. We go to node 4 and then go ahead to node 5. So all nodes of our prime path are visited by this test path with a detour, not in a way that's defined in our prime path. In our prime path, the way is defined by this path: 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 5, 6. This tour visit all edges of our prime path except this one. So we have a detour. We have a detour in this tour. Okay. Let me come back to the slide. So we define these three concepts again: tour, a test path P, tour, subpath Q if Q is a subpath of P. Tour with a side strip, a test path P, tour, a subpath Q with side strip. Inside the strip, it's important to every edge in Q also visited in P in the same order. So the tour can include a side strip as long as it comes back to the same node. And tour with detour, a test path P, tour subpath Q with detours if and only if every node in Q is also in P in the same order. The order of our nodes in our prime path is important in this concept, this notion, and the order of our node, our edge, is important in this notion. So in the tour with detours, a tour can include a detour from node Ni as long as it comes back to the prime path at a successor of Ni. For example, in this graph, we come back at successor of node 3. The successor of node 3 in our prime path is node 5. Okay, so we want to touring our prime path. This is a prime path. We could touring our prime path in 3 ways. The first tour is the same as our prime path. The second tour could be this one, and the third way could be this one. The first tour just is the same as our prime path, but the second and the third test path is not the same as our prime path. But this one visit all edges of our prime path in the same order, and this one visit all nodes of our prime path in the same order. So we could treat, so we could have 3 test cases to handle this loop. 3 test cases. The first test case, execute loop 0 times. The second one, execute loop once, and the third one again execute loop once. Okay, so this is a prime path, and Turing with side trip could be this one, and Turing with a detour is this one. Okay. If you have questions, please ask your questions. Okay, no question. These concepts are explained in introduced videos in previous lecture. I hope you have seen those videos. They could help you a lot in understanding these concepts. What is infeasible test requirement? As you know, we have defined infeasible test requirements in many cases. An infeasible test requirement, as you know, cannot be satisfied by any test cases. For example, if we have a dead code, or we have an unreachable statement in our program, such as dead code, we cannot execute them at all. We cannot execute statements that are located after a return statement. The statements that are common after a return statement is not executed, or not executed at all. They are dead code. Or statements that they are located in a condition structure, such as if structure, with contradictions, could not be executed at all. If we have some conditions, such as this condition, for any x variable x, for example, x could be an integer value or float or double value, each x could not be at the same time be greater than 0 and less than 0. Okay, so this is a contradiction. The statements that located in a if body statement, if statement, which is conditioned by this contradiction, could not be executed at all. So in our control flow graph, we have some edges and nodes with respect of this dead code and this contradicted statement, which cannot be covered at all by any test case. There are no test cases to cover this edge and node. So they are infeasible. They define infeasible test requirements. And this is common for all test criteria. All test criteria may have some infeasible test requirements. And it's important for you to know that it's usually undecidable. We could not determine any piece of code defines an infeasible test requirement simply. It's difficult to prove that a piece of code defines infeasible test requirement. To prove that we have no infeasible test requirement, we should test all possible input values, and as you know, it is impossible. So this is undecidable problem, undecidable concept. Okay. When site trips are not allowed, many structural criteria have more infeasible test requirement. It's trivial for you, and you have seen before, in this slide, when site trips are not allowed, so this edge could not be covered in edge coverage criteria or in edge pair coverage criteria, and this node could not be covered in node coverage criteria. Okay, so we should allow a site trip in our test passes, but in a controlled way, because when we run this loop more times, we just waste our resources, because when this loop executes normally for example 1 million times, we have not to execute all these times this loop, because these executions waste our resources. We just want to execute this loop around its boundaries. For example, when we never can go into the loop body, which means execute 0 times loop. When we go to the loop for the first time in its boundary value, and when we go ahead, when we come back from the loop for the last value of our boundary condition. These situations are important, but all order of executions is unnecessary execution. So when some side trips are not allowed, many structural criteria have more infeasible requirements. However, always allowing side trips weakens test criteria. What's the solution? If we have not allowed some trip, we have some infeasible test criteria. If we allow some trip, it weakens test criteria. How we should treat with this problem? A practical recommendation for this problem is doing the best effort Turing. What's the best effort Turing? Satisfy as many test requirements as possible with some trip. First of all, we try to cover all test requirements without some side trip. Okay, if we have some test requirements that have not been covered by test passes that are generated in this phase, we try to cover them by some side trips. Allow side trips to try to satisfy remaining test requirements. Usually, most of test requirements could be covered without side trip. Some of them could not be covered by these simple passes. When we have loops in our program, we should allow side trips to satisfy the remaining test requirements. So the test requirements which are related to our loops should be covered by side trips. But how we should treat to side trips to not weaken the test criteria? If we try to cover prime passes, just cover prime passes, we have deal with this problem, because we just run our trips in a controlled way for some cases that we have defined in previous slides. For cases in which we have execute loops 0 times, 1 times, and more than 1 times. 3 test cases are enough to test loops. For example, we summarize by this example at this slide our thoughts. To detect simple passes, as I told you, we start passes of length 0. This simple passes of length 0 is the least of all nodes of our control flow graph. So these are all passes of length 0 in this control flow graph. In this control flow graph, we have 7 nodes. So all of these nodes define simple passes of length 0. This last one is marked by this symbol. This said us that this node is a final node. So this path terminates at a final node. Okay. Then we go ahead with the simple passes of length 2, of length 1, excuse me. All edges of this graph defines a simple pass of length 1. So simply we list all edges for simple passes of list 1. All edges 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4, 3, 5, 4, 7, 5, 7, 5, 6, and 6, 5. All of these edges define all simple passes of length 1. Please look at this mark. These marks, as I told, define passes which ends at a final node. As you know, node 7 is a final node. Okay. Then we go ahead with passes of length 2. All edge pairs of this control flow graph defines all passes of length 2. 1, 2, 3. 1, 3, 4. 1, 3, 5. 2, 4, 7. 2, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 5. 3, 4, 7. 3, 5, 7. 5, 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 6, 5, 7, 3, 5, 6. All of these are edge pairs of our control flow graph. And please note that these edge pairs, defines loop. 5, 6, 5 defines a cycle. 6, 5, 6 is cycle looping. So this mark means pass cycle. Then we go ahead with passes of length 3 and we continue so on. Passes of length 3 is listed in this box, and these passes all ends at final nodes except this one. This one finished in a non-final node, but we cannot go ahead at this node. When we reach to this node from this path, from this node, we could not go to this node again because this leads to an internal loop and our path be a non-prime path, non-simple path. So this path is also a path that ends with a node that we cannot go ahead more. If we go ahead to another node, the path turns to a not simple path. Okay, this is the same for this path. This passes terminated. This is a simple passes, could not be extended, but this simple path could be extended to other passes. This pass could be subpass of another simple pass. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 5 could be a subpass of this pass. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7. Or could be a subpass of 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. These passes could be extended to passes which have more lengths, which have bigger lengths. Okay, but these passes could not be extended. For example, in these passes, we terminate at a final node, and as you know, final node have no existence edge and could not be extended. And when we try to extend these passes, which is terminates at a non-final node, if we try to extend this pass, for example this pass, we should go ahead to node 5 again, and we know that we have visited node 5 in this pass previously, so we have a loop on our path. So this is not be a simple path, and the definition of simple path is violated by this loop. So this node could be extended to other simple passes. Okay, then go ahead with passes of length 4. We have 3 passes of length 4. All of them are terminated passes, so none of them could be extended to passes with bigger lengths. Okay, this is the process of detecting all simple passes. How we detect, how we extract prime passes. As you know, prime pass is a subset of these passes, because a prime pass is a specific simple pass which could not be subpass of another simple pass. So these all passes of length 4 could be a prime pass, because none of these simple passes could be a subpass of others. Okay, none of these could be a subpass of the others. This said, none of these passes could not be a subpass of these passes with smaller lengths. It's trivial. And on the other hand, none of these passes could be a subpass of these other two passes. Okay, so this said, these 3 test passes, these 3 simple passes are prime passes. So to define prime passes, we told you why these are prime, and we go ahead, we come back to simple passes with smaller lengths. In the simple pass with smaller lengths, we reach to length 3. From length 4 we reach to length 3, and if you check this final test passes. This non-final, this non-terminated test passes could be executed, could be extended by these test passes, and these test passes, these simple passes, are sub-passes of some of these simple passes. But in this set, if we check, we see some of them specifically, especially these three passes which start by a non-initial node, could be subsumed, could be sub-passes of some of these test passes. 2, 3, 4, 7. 2, 3, 4, 7 is a sub-pass of this pass. So this could not be a prime pass. But those of them which started by an initial node and terminated at a final node, or at a terminated node in a loop which could not be extended, so these are prime pass. These are prime passes of length 3. We go ahead with passes of length 2. As I told you, these passes which are not marked by any of these symbols could not be a prime pass, because they are extensible. They could be extended by passes with bigger lenses. Okay, but among other test passes, some of them could be covered by test passes with bigger lenses, such as 3, 4, 7. 3, 4, 7. Okay. Or 3, 5, 7. 3, 5, 7 is a subpass of this test pass. Or 3, 5, 6 is a subpass of this pass. But none of these test passes, these simple passes, could not be covered by any other prime passes, any other detected prime passes. So they are marked as prime pass of length 2, which tries to test our loop, which started with any node located in our loop. Okay. To cover these prime passes, we should define some test passes that they can cover them. How we define test passes in order to cover all of these prime passes? We want to cover all of these prime passes by fewer test passes. We try to have fewer test passes. So we defined a new notion as a round trip. What's a round trip pass? A round trip pass is a prime pass that starts and ends at the same node. Round trip pass. We want to define passes to cover some of our prime passes, such as these passes. Okay, so these passes start from a node and ends again at that node, this one and this one. So we define round trip as a prime pass that starts and ends at the same node. Round trip. Simple round trip coverage criteria is defined as this definition. All test requirements contains at least one round trip pass for each reachable node. If we can define a cycle by a reachable node, we should define a round trip pass. For example, in this graph, we could define a cycle for this node and for this one. So we have to define two round trip paths, at least two round trip paths. Okay. Test requirement in this coverage criteria contains at least one round trip path for each reachable node. In graph G, that begins and ends a round trip path. Complete round trip path coverage criteria is defined, which subsumes simple round trip path coverage criteria. In this coverage criteria, we define test requirements as all round trip passes for each reachable node. All round trip passes for each reachable node. In this simple round trip coverage, we need to have at least one round trip pass. But in this complete round trip pass, we should have all round trip passes in our test requirement. So it's trivial that this coverage criteria subsumes this one. This criteria omit nodes and edges that are not in round trip path. Please check this item for this definition later. How this item could be true with respect to these definitions. They do not subsume edge pairs, edge or node coverage. Why? Why these coverage criteria don't subsume edge pair, edge or node coverage criteria? Why? Because when we talk about round trip, we just talk about the loops and not other nodes of our graph. When we define our coverage criteria as node coverage, we should cover all nodes of graph, not nodes just located in our loops. The round trip coverage criteria in both forms, simple form or complete form, talks about loops, about cycles. So they are not subsumed, they could not subsume edge pair, edge or node coverage criteria. These coverage criteria are defined just for handling loops. Okay. This is the final slide. Is defined in this set for structural coverage criteria. So we have several coverage criteria for structural coverage criteria. We start with edge coverage, node coverage, and go ahead with edge pair coverage. We have defined prime pass coverage. We have defined complete pass coverage. We defined simple round trip coverage and complete round trip coverage. These are all coverage criteria which I have defined for structural coverage criteria. We turn on to another notion as data flow criteria. In data flow, the goal of checking data flow criteria is to ensure that values or any variable are computed and used correctly. So in this coverage criteria, we focus on when and how our values for our variables are computed and when they are used and how they are used. Are they used correctly, or are they computed or defined correctly? It's important in software testing. So we define some other coverage criteria for data flow according to data flow graph. Probably you are familiar with data flow graph in compiler course in your bachelor study. Two notions are important in this criteria, these types of criteria, are definition and use. Each variable in our program could be defined and then could be used. Could be defined in some statement of our program and then could be used in later statements of our program. Okay. So a location where a value for a variable is stored in memory could be defined as def location. This location could be any node of our control flow graph or any edge of our control. So a location where a value for a variable is stored in memory could be defined as a def location. Okay. And on the other hand, we have use location. A location where a variable's value is accessed. When a variable's value is read, or when it contributes in computation some other variables. For example, in a typical program, suppose we have this control flow graph. In this control flow graph, suppose that we defined the value of x variable at this location, and then we use it in these two locations. In this location, we use value x to compute the value of z. And this location, again, we use x in another way to compute the value of this variable. Okay, so there are two uses for this definition. This is a definition location for x, and these are two locations in which we use this variable. Okay, so look at this box, and we want to fill these sets. The def locations for the def variables in location 1 is just x, and the def location in 5, the def location 5 defines just z, and in location 6 we also define z. Okay, uses in this location is just x. In this location we just use x variable. So user 5 is a set in which we have only one variable, and this is the same for the next one. Okay, in location 6 we have used just this variable. Okay, the values given in defs should reach at least one, some or all possible uses. Please note to this piece of sentence. The values given in defs, should be reached at least one, some or more possible uses. According to these three options, we could define three different coverage criteria. Let me go ahead. We define du pairs and du passes accordingly. Def n or def e defines the set of variables that are defined by node n or by edge e. Def n, as you saw in this example, def 1 is the set of all variables defined in location 1, in node 1. Def 5 is a set of all variables that are defined in node 5. This is true for all nodes. This could be defined for all edges. For any edge of our control flow graph, we could have some variables to be defined. Okay, so we define def e in the same manner as the set of variables that are defined by edge e. And in the same way, we can define use n and use e. The use n is the set of variables that are used by node n, and the use e is the set of variables that are used by edge e. According to these definitions, we define du pair. What's a du pair? A pair of locations Li and Lj such that a variable v is defined at Li, location I, and then used at location j. So y and 5 could be a du pair. Def use a pair of definition, and then it's used. And 1 and 6 could be a DU pair, because a variable is defined in location 1 and then it's used in location 6. So this could define a DU pair. So a DU pair is defined as a pair of locations Li and Lj such that a variable v is defined at location I and then it's used in location Lj. A def clear path is defined as a path from location I to location j with respect to a variable v if e is not given another value on any of the nodes or edges in the path. Suppose we have this control flow graph. This could be a def clear path. Def clear path for this DU pair, because in intermediate nodes there are no other definitions for the variable x. The variable x is just defined at location 1 and there are no any other definition for x along the path until we use it. So this is a def clear path. And so with this one is also a def clear path 1, 2, 4, 5, because there are no any other definitions for x in these two intermediate nodes or in this edge. Okay, so this is a def clear path. Okay, we define this notion again. A path from location I to location j is a def clear with respect to a variable v if v is not given another value on any of the nodes or edges in the path. The next notion is reach. What's the definition of reach? If there is a def clear path from location I to location j with respect to some variable v, the def of v at location I reached the use at location j. For example, in previous control flow graph, this definition reaches this use and this one. These two uses locations are reachable from this definition. These two uses locations, location node 5 and location node 6, both of them are reachable from this definition node. So location 5 is reached from x and so on with location 6. The next notion is DU path. DU path is a simple subpath that is def clear with respect v from a def of v to a use of v. I explained this notion when I talked about def clear. And du ni to nj with respect to variable v defines the set of all du passes from Ni to Nj. For example, in previous control flow graph, du passes from location I to location 6 have two passes. The first one is this pass and the second one is this one. And this du pair 1 and 5 have again two passes, this pass and this pass. These passes are subpasses or simple subpasses that is depth clear with respect to V, from a definition node to a use node. Okay, set of all du passes from Ni to Nj. Du Ni and V defines the set of all du passes that starts at node I. For this last one, we have four du passes. Suppose we have one definition, but we have two uses. So for the last notion, we have four passes. One of them is this one of them is this one. These are two passes that connect node 1 to node 6, and we have two other passes that connect node 1 to node 5, because the 1 to all uses of X is defined by these four passes, as I explained before. Du Ni with respect to variable V, the set of all du passes that start at Ni. Okay. We define Turing du passes, a test pass P, du tours subpasses D with respect to variable V if P tours D and the subpass taken is depth clear with respect to V. As you know, a test pass should be started at initial node, and it should end at a final node. And a test pass, when a test pass tours some du pass, we say that the test pass du tours that du passes. Okay, I will explain this notion by an example in later slides. And we could have side trip again for covering all du pairs. Some of du pairs, some of uses are located in loops, and we have to use side trip and detours to cover them. The time is over. A mid-course exam could be usable, could be very valuable. If you want, we could have a mid-course exam, no problem. If you want, we can take an exam next week, no problem. It could be very valuable. You could be familiar with our testing, with our questions in your final. If you are agree with this suggestion, we can take an exam next week. Okay, let me go ahead. According to our talks, we could have three types of criteria for covering DU pairs. Use every definition, get every use once, or follow all DU passes. Could be three types of our coverage criteria that formally defined in later slides. All diff coverage. Let me see. Excuse me, the time is over. Let me explain this coverage criteria in next session. Please ask your questions if you have any question. This time I have no problem with this time. No problem. You can be ready for this time and I take an exam. Okay. Please ask your questions. No question. How about your representation? Your research, your study research. You should present your research activity in some extra sessions that we can start in next week. We should define we have two extra chapters to teach, and we need our ordinary sessions to teaching those chapters, and we should define some extra sessions for your presentations. If you can ready for next week, we can start your presentation, and I hope all of you be ready for doing your representation. In which chapter your exam? The exam in this time, because okay, I will take an exam from chapter 1 to chapter 7, except chapter 4. We have omitted the chapter 4. Just the chapter 4 is omitted in our lectures. No, I will finish chapter 7 next session, and you should be ready for that time. Let me see your results, and I decide about marks. If you are good in your exam, we consider more marks, and else we consider less. Okay, if you have no question, it's too much. You should be ready for your final exam.